I want to talk about the Christian Christmas nativity scene and how what we think of when we think of this nativity scene has been so influenced by tradition, art, and culture instead of by what is actually in the text. And we do this with everything. People in general, but especially religious ideas, get exaggerated and renamed and reframed all the time. Think about hell and heaven. Think about the Garden of Eden and the original fall. Think about what is supposed to happen during the rapture and tribulation. If you ask any Christian on the street to describe these things to you, you will almost certainly get details that are not anywhere in any part of any canon. And again, this is very normal. And so I do want to talk about the biblically accurate nativity scene, but not just to poke holes in it for a fun little Christmas episode, but because I think it is indicative and representative of a larger issue within religion, but specifically today we're talking about Christianity. So at the very end, I'm going to cover a few reasons why this matters, but to start the video, we're going to talk about what a biblically accurate nativity scene looks like, which is hard to do because we have two versions of the story, one in Matthew and one in Luke, and they are night and day different from each other. But mainly I want to talk about the nativity. So to start, let's talk about what most of us think of when we think of this, when we set up our nativities around Christmas time, when we're driving around and we see the setup outside of the church, when we look at art or painting. Even in Home Alone 1, I was just watching this with my children. It's everywhere, and it's always a little bit different. And by the way, some Christians and churches and representations get it more biblically close than others, but you wouldn't be surprised to see the following. Mary and Joseph with young Jesus in a manger, a few shepherds and sheep, maybe some cows, maybe a donkey, 3 wise men on the other side carrying their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. An angel is often hanging out, sometimes looking right over Jesus, sometimes within the barn or stable, sometimes outside floating, and then of course the star that led the Magi there. And it's usually shown in some kind of a barn or a stable or even a cave. There are other depictions that go even further. We're not going to be talking about any little drummer boys or anything like that. We're going to stick to kind of, I think that's a generic American Christian idea of the nativity. But what does the Bible say? Well, let's talk about the setting first. This stable or barn or cave, no. We get a word inn, which in Greek, kataluma, might mean guest room or side room, not a commercial inn. And yes, a manger is a feeding trough for animals, but that could have again been this family had some animals they took care of, and in a lower room they kept the feed, and that is where Mary and Joseph went. We get no word that indicates stable, barn, or cave. We get no animals listed at all in either narrative. And so very quickly, the setting is already looking very different. The next major difference, I think, would be the Magi. First of all, sometimes we hear them referred to as kings, not biblical. These wise men would not have been at the birth of Jesus. We see no indication of this whatsoever. In one story, we have the wise men. In another, we have the shepherds. There's no overlap. We know the shepherds were there at the birth because the sign that they would find the right baby is that he would be wrapped in cloths in a manger, and they were also nearby. But these Magi that get sent, this could have been years later. First of all, they come to visit him in a house. In context, it seems the house would have been Mary and Joseph's house that they came to. Also, it's at the whole time of King Herod's orders to kill all babies under 2, which means that time has probably passed since Herod found out about this, and Jesus is most likely older. So were there Magi standing there next to shepherds insofar as the Christian tradition story tells it biblically? No. Probably years later. We never hear that there were 3 of them. That's just a guess that people make because there's 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Not kings and not at the time of Jesus's birth. So wildly different. So take the Magi, they are now gone from the nativity. Just like all those animals. The picture is starting to shrink significantly. But the shepherds were there, right? Yes, insofar as the story goes, the shepherds were there, but there's a few things that are going to be an issue for the shepherds. Just as part of the story, many of you will know the famous scene of the angels singing to the shepherds, but it didn't happen. An angel comes and tells the shepherds what's going on, and then a multitude of the heavenly hosts show up and they praise God. They never mention singing and not directly referenced to the shepherds either. Just another fun little thing that got wrapped up in tradition and is not biblically there. Also, the star that is supposedly hanging out over the stable, the inn, what have you. We could have done an entire episode about the star. But you know why it doesn't matter is because it wasn't there at Jesus' birth, because that is what led the Magi to him, and we know they didn't come at the time of his birth. And even if they did, the kind of historical, cultural understanding of what this was trying to allude to is that these Magi may have been Zoroastrians with this kind of astrology fix, and so God is using what they're already studying, and they're seeing, oh, hey, there's an anomaly here. This star is moving in a way that stars don't move. We know that because we study the stars, and so they follow the moving star in the way that many people throughout much of time have followed stars for directions, and in no way did it ever just stop or hover over a small local setting. Following a star so you go in a certain direction is one thing, but this idea that it just slowly came down out of the sky and moved right over, like, it's insane when you understand what stars are and what we're seeing, just starlight. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It can't work. It doesn't work. So every single time you see this bright glowing star over the barn in the nativity scene, dead wrong. So no animals, no magi, no angel, because even the angel that told the shepherds, we get no indication that he came with them to see Jesus. So sometimes there's an angel in the scene. He'll be in the barn with them. Sometimes he's hovering in the barn. Sometimes he's outside next to the star floating around. Nope, no angel. And again, no star. What a very different scene. Kind of a sad, smaller scene. Maybe that's another reason for the tradition and culture and art that has depicted it as this huge event. And it's funny because in some of the reading about the birth of Jesus, you do get that it is such an event. In fact, in reading about the shepherds in Luke, verse 15, it's kind of funny. When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, so the angels go back to heaven, so no angel by the stable, the shepherds said to one another, let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about. And when they had seen him, verse 17, they spread the word concerning what had been told to them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. And I think we read something similar in Matthew, but it's a little bit different because it's with the Magi. But again, you get God was orchestrating all of these people to come and bear witness and give gifts and acknowledge the Messiah. And I know that Jesus' childhood is not mentioned, at least in the gospel canons, other than his time at the temple. But when he pops up at 30 during his ministry and everyone is like, who is this guy? What is he about? Nothing good comes out of this area and all of these things. It's like, what was the point of God leading all these witnesses to the birth, this magnificent event of his son, his chosen Messiah, for that to just fall away? Like, if everyone who heard it was so amazed, there should have been talk about Jesus from the time he was a baby. Everyone always expecting and waiting. No surprise when at 30 he begins this ministry. You know how Jesus couldn't do miracles in his town because he wasn't believed or respected as a prophet or whatever the verse says? That should have been the last thing that happened. His town should have been the town that was like, oh no, we know. Didn't you hear about what happened at his birth? Like, I always just think that part is crazy. But again, those are the main differences in the nativity scene. Also, I can't not point this part out because you remember when everyone comes to the stable and they find little sweet Jesus and they say, oh, Immanuel, except they don't, do they? No one ever calls him Immanuel in the entire Bible, except when we get Matthew trying to make this connection. So in Matthew 1:21, she will give birth to a son and you are to give him the name Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. Jesus meaning Yahweh saves. But in Matthew 1:22 through 23, verses later, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Immanuel, which means God with us. And then in Matthew 1:25, and he gave him the name Jesus. It's just amazing to see right there Matthew, or the anonymous author who wrote Matthew, trying so hard, and he does this throughout the entire book, by the way, to attribute Old Testament prophecy to Jesus. And it's like, no, they didn't call him Immanuel. And you can get in the weeds and argue about the differences between, well, Jesus is a proper name and Immanuel is kind of this theological or significant or symbolic name. But again, no one uses Immanuel. And also, we know the verse that he's referring to was referring to a local, time-related situation and people from Isaiah 7:14. I also think I'll just take the time to point out some of the differences between Matthew and Luke's account of the birth of Jesus. Then we'll get into why this matters and we'll close out. Both of these gospel authors tried to list the genealogies for Jesus, and they are mutually exclusive. The Annunciation is different between Matthew and Luke. In Matthew, the angel appears to Joseph in a dream to announce Mary's pregnancy, but in Luke, the angel Gabriel appears directly to Mary to announce the pregnancy. Now, both of these, again, we're talking like the story is true. Both of these things could be true at the same time. Not all contradictions are mutually exclusive, but again, think about this. Think about these two gospel writers supposedly digging around for eyewitness testimony, writing down what they have, and yet we get such wildly different accounts. Some of them mutually exclusive, some of them not. But either way, the things that one will leave out that the other will cover, like the massacre of the innocents only being found in one of them, that's insane. That should have been the first thing they both talked about. But another contradiction is the origin of Mary and Joseph. Matthew implies that Mary and Joseph were already living in Bethlehem before the birth of Jesus. But in Luke, it states they lived in Nazareth and only traveled to Bethlehem for this made-up census because Luke needed him to fulfill prophecy. We see the same thing with only in one of the accounts do they have to flee to Egypt because out of Egypt my son is called. Again, so many things are being manipulated to happen to fulfill prophecy, and they don't all work together. They just cannot. You cannot flee to Egypt, but then at the same time, a few days later, be at the temple. So we have all these fake events, including the census itself, which is the next contradiction. In Matthew, we have no mention of census because we didn't need it. But in Luke, supposedly, this thing that never happened, that we have no documentation for, where you make everybody go back to their town of origin under Quirinius from Roman authority, it's bananas. So not only the contradiction between the two gospels, but what is factually wrong about them. And this list could be so much bigger. I'm giving you highlights here. We've talked about the birthplace differences. We've talked about the visitors differences. We talked about the differences with the timing of events between the shepherds and the magi. In Matthew, a star guides the magi, but there's no star mentioned in Luke because there's no magi because it's just shepherds. In Matthew, Herod plays this insanely significant role, and in Luke, no mention of Herod or the massacre of the innocents whatsoever. Again, still because of that, in Matthew, you get what I mentioned earlier, the flight to Egypt, but in Luke, there's not even a mention of a flight to Egypt, and more specifically, we hear what they did instead. They returned to Nazareth shortly after presenting Jesus at the temple, which according to Jewish custom and law, we know when that would have been. And again, it could not be at the same time they were in Egypt. So again, no presentation of Jesus at the temple in Matthew, but a big story of it in Luke. In fact, we have the man who wanted to stay alive until he could see the Messiah. Again, a lot of work being done to make sure we know this is indeed the Messiah. Simeon can now die because he has seen the Messiah. And the great prophetess Anna, who recognizes him as the Messiah, a woman who never even left the synagogue, worshiping and fasting constantly. At least it's nice to get some female representation. Also, the tactics taken are different between the Gospels. So again, Matthew is all about trying to go back to prophecy as the main tactic. He's utilizing Jeremiah and Hosea and Isaiah. But Luke is like, nah, we don't need any of that prophecy. I'm not going to dig through and try to fix all this, although he does that with other things. And it's more about the supernatural, what the angels say and proclaim. And just so you know, I'm not being petty, another difference is the perspective that is taken. Matthew focuses on Joseph's perspective and Luke focuses on Mary's perspective, and that's kind of cool, and that would be fine. That's an example of two people writing the same story but with slightly different views, and then you're going to get different details. The problem is when those later details completely don't work together in many of the ways that we've already covered. Even Jesus's title, which should have been so supremely important, is different between these two accounts. In Matthew, Jesus is King of the Jews, and thus a threat to Herod. We have to name him differently so that we can justify the threat, so we can justify the massacre of the innocent, so we can justify the flight to Egypt, so we can get to that prophecy. So much work being done. But since that's not having to be done in Luke, we get a savior for all people with the angel proclaiming good news of great joy. Very different titles and expectations for this same little baby. We talked about the angels, the return to Nazareth is different as well, and the list just goes on and on and on. So why does all this matter? Specifically poking holes in the differences of the nativity story and what we see in everyday representation versus the biblical text. The role of tradition over scripture. This is a perfect example of this. How much of what people truly believe is based on scripture and how much is just inherited cultural storytelling? To the skeptic, I think this shows very clearly how religion evolves. It adapts to its societal needs over time. And I think it's nice to do it with a lighter story like the Nativity, but when you start applying this to things like heaven and hell, salvation, our ability to know if we're saved or not, once saved, always saved, or being able to lose your salvation, the concept of the Trinity, which denomination to follow, what church to go to, what to do with your money, how to live, all of of it. And if so much of what you believe or think you believe is based off the evolution of these concepts over time as they were applied differently with different standards and different facts in different times to fit different scenarios and different needs, maybe it's a good time for the believer of anything to examine why. And that's what I did with my Christian belief years ago that led to my deconversion. It just became clear to me what I try to preach so often here, the man-made nature of this thing. Again, imagine this story is true. The first and only time the world has ever born a God king. The greatest being that would ever live comes as a little baby, and within 33 years is sacrificed for the sin of mankind, only to be resurrected. That story, if true, should be perfect and whole, completely accounted for, without error, without contradiction, without issue. But if it's a made-up story, like all other made-up stories about myth and lore and legend, then we would expect to see exactly what we have. Differing and contradictory accounts, and a tale that grows even more bombastic over time. The embellished nativity creates kind of this emotionally charged, idealized image that is meant to evoke awe and reverence. But when you peel back all of these things and you see how, first of all, they can't work together, it didn't happen like that, it was rather simple and small and almost ordinary. It takes a lot of that oomph out of it. And you can say that doesn't matter, but if it doesn't matter, why add it all on? Why is no Christmas song or movie or play or piece of artwork good enough with just how the Bible describes it? Why do we have to go to these extents? It is because there is this emotional appealing that is part of the evolution of Christianity over time that plays itself out. Realizing that, seeing that, and all the other ways that this religion or any religion or ideology or belief system does this to you is important for the ability to critically think. We should look at these things not to be small and pedantic, but to encourage critical thinking, to not take things so easily. Develop skills to question these things at a larger scale. Don't be afraid to look for truth. How many Christians have said, yep, I always knew that, in the back of my mind that bothered me, but for the next 10 years, the next 5 years, the next 30 years, my entire life, I just didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to address it. I didn't want to look closely. I was afraid of what I might find, or it felt heretical to question or to look, or I felt bad or sinful for doubting. If this is perfect truth, it can hold up to anything. The fact in a 20-minute video I can point out so many errors in what should be one of the most important stories in the Bible that is New Testament, that you have 4 different accounts for, that still we have all of these issues, that's insane. And again, completely what you would expect for a man-made religion that evolves over time. But I'm going to stop because there's so much more we could say, but I think I've made my point with today's particular video. Let me know any interesting facts you know about the differences between the stories. Why do you think Matthew and Luke are so wildly different from each other? Why do you think that over time we do this where the original stories aren't good enough and we have to add all of this extra in? Am I reading too far into all of this? Does none of this matter? I think that it does. And I think understanding these things and seeing how they play themselves out, not just in one story or one book of the Bible, but in all stories and all books of the Bible and all religion and all belief systems in general, can give us a really healthy understanding of what happens to us, how we believe things, what we think about, why we think about those things, what we're influenced by. And as someone who thinks that truth is important, I think those are things we should be aware of and knowledgeable about. So, thank you. Merry Christmas, Happy Holiday, whatever you want to say. Have a wonderful, wonderful season. Enjoy your friends and family. Be grateful, be kind, find middle ground, compromise where you can. Understand that your friends and your family are more important than any theological difference you may have today. Just my small encouragement from an atheist on Christmas to be the bigger person in the scenarios where you might need to be. There are plenty of Christians that are also having to step up to the plate today. Thanks so much for being here. I think I'll see you Thursday still with a video, but for sure next Sunday. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, GVI, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, Shawn, and Tom, my Humanist heroes, James, Jarrod, Kristi, and Thronus, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Lisa, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks and have a great day.